All right, ladies and gentlemen, the 2024 fantasy football season is officially over, and we are headed right into the 2025 fantasy football off season. So, with that being said, I'm going to run through the first 4 rounds of a 2025 fantasy football mock draft and just go over who I think are the top 48 players going into next season, and then talk about a couple players that maybe didn't make the cut or make the video, but are definitely in contention, and just a first overall look at what we can expect in terms of a mock draft going into the coming fantasy season. All right, so at the 1.1 through the 1.3, I think that we're going to have 3 players at the top of the boards as you guys start to see people do early drafts on sites like Underdog, or you guys start to see early mock draft content. And I think for a majority of drafts at this point in the offseason, at the 1.1, you are more than likely going to see Jamar Chase off of the board. But I do think that the next 2 players that are going to be selected are also in contention to come off of the board at this point in time as well. But I think that Chase, like I said, finishing the season as the wide receiver 1 is going to be the player that you most commonly see taken off of the board. And I think that's all we really need to say. The wide receiver 1 on the season only had a single-digit performance once throughout the entirety of the season and was great through the fantasy playoffs and had some monster games right before the fantasy playoffs as well. Wide receiver 1 on the season, like I said, 1,600 receiving yards, actually over 1,600 receiving yards, off of 117 receptions, 161 targets, and 16 touchdowns. More than likely going to get re-signed to the Bengals, or at least get that contract extension this coming off season. Going to be paired with Joe Burrow. No reason to have any doubt about Jamar Chase going into the coming season. Next up, I'm going to go with another wide receiver, although I do think that there's a running back that could go here, and that's going to be Justin Jefferson of the Minnesota Vikings. Also had a fantastic season, your wide receiver 2 on the 2024 fantasy football season. Once again, was very productive through the fantasy playoffs, had some big games right before the fantasy playoffs as well. Single digits twice on the season, surprisingly, against the Jaguars, and then in a bit of a tough matchup against the Bears in a game where Jordan Addison got a lot of attention. And I think that some people may argue, you look at Justin Jefferson going into next season, is it going to be Sam Darnold at quarterback? Are the Vikings going to roll with JJ McCarthy? Are they going to try and sign another quarterback? I think, especially with the way that the Vikings season is looking like in terms of wrapping up in week 18, more than likely they will re-sign Sam Darnold, but it's hard to say. So maybe you could argue that. But once again, that was the argument this past year about being a little bit lower on Justin Jefferson. And, well, he was just fine, right? And the unknown at quarterback did not matter, although Sam Darnold had a great season. But nonetheless, I think JJ at the 1.2 makes a lot of sense. But I think it could also be the next player who will take off the board at the 1.3, and that is Saquon Barkley. And like I said at the beginning of the video, I could see Barkley going at the 1.1 even. I mean, I really don't think that is crazy whatsoever. Barkley finishing the year as the RB1 on the season, single digits 3 times on the year. Unfortunately, one of those was in the first round of the fantasy playoffs, but was great right after that with 27 fantasy points in week 16, 18.9 in week 17, over 2,000 rushing yards, 13 rushing touchdowns, 2 receiving touchdowns, 33 receptions. Monster season. Now, I think some may argue for Barkley that, well, it's going to be really hard to replicate that production next year, and I don't think it even really makes a ton of sense for the Eagles to try and give Barkley that same type of production next year. But nonetheless, he's set for over 1,000 rushing yards, at least 8 rushing touchdowns, and involvement in the passing game. So I think Barkley is easily the next running back taken off of the board. Now, really, when we start to get to the 1.4 through just about the 1.9, maybe the 1.10, maybe even a little bit further, we're really early in the offseason, and this could go in a lot of different directions. But I'm going to go ahead and make the argument here for another running back to go off of the board. And I'm going to say Bijan Robinson is our next player off of the board. Although, like I said, I think it could be a lot of different players and a lot of wide receivers as well. But Bijan, finally, I mean, maybe not finally, but really just lived up to his ADP, right? Even if it was in theory a little bit of a slow start at the beginning of the season. And really, even in theory, while he went earlier in drafts going into 2023, he was still a top 10 running back in 2023 in PPR formats. But right now, he's going to finish the season as the RB3 in 2024 and just had this really incredible stretch, week 6 through week 17 of the season, where he only scored under 20 fantasy points twice in that stretch. And on the season, did not have a single digit performance all year long. And maybe look at this Falcons offense next year. What exactly are they going to be with Michael Penix at quarterback? There's still some issues. Like, what is the ceiling with a guy like Kyle Pitts, and is Drake London a true wide receiver one? Although London did have a good season, maybe you have some question marks about the Falcons. But I think the easiest question mark to eliminate is the fact that Bijan Robinson is the clear-cut RB1 on this team. A monster season, over 1,200 rushing yards, 12 rushing touchdowns, 59 receptions, a receiving touchdown on the season. I guess that was a little bit low, but nonetheless, like I said, going to finish as the RB3 on the season. I like Bijan there at the 1.4, but I do think he could end up going a couple spots later as well. The next up, sitting at the 1.5, once again, I think a lot of names that could go here, but I will go ahead and take CeeDee Lamb off of the board. Number of wide receivers I like here, but I think that Lamb is as solid of a selection as you're going to get. I know he finished out the season on IR, but if he was able to play in week 17, I think he would have had another solid game. And he was really solid at the end of the season. I know he had the game against the Giants, the game against the Eagles. He was dealing with different injuries, but the fact that he was so solid, even dealing with those injuries, trying to play through those injuries, and could have easily, he's already gotten paid and everything, could have easily skipped out on a couple more of these games and chose not to and played until he absolutely had to play on IR. Says a lot about CeeDee Lamb as a player. And on the season, single digits just 3 times, 17 and a half or more fantasy points in his final 3 games of the season, a ceiling of 39.6 fantasy points, just under 1,200 receiving yards, 6 receiving touchdowns, 152 targets, 101 receptions, wide receiver 6 on the season, and he did almost half of that with Cooper Rush at quarterback. No disrespect to Cooper Rush, but we'll get a healthy Dak Prescott next year, or at least I would assume so. So I like Lamb a lot. I think there are a lot of wide receivers that we're about to talk about that are kind of neck and neck here. But for the sake of argument, we'll go Lamb here. And then the next player that we will take off of the board will be another wide receiver. That's going to be Amon-Ra St. Brown. And you could easily argue that Amon-Ra should be a little bit higher here, maybe ahead of CeeDee Lamb finishing the season. More than likely is the wide receiver 4. I am technically recording this before Monday Night Football between the Lions and the Niners has wrapped up, but Amon-Ra St. Brown should finish the year as a top 5 wide receiver. Just under 1,200 receiving yards, 11 receiving touchdowns for Amon-Ra, 124 targets, 101 receptions, single digits on the season just twice, not including the Monday night game against the Niners. We'll see how that one wraps out. And, I mean, you just know exactly what you're going to get out of Amon-Ra St. Brown, right? Just a consistent floor, no matter what. Touchdowns, red zone targets, tons of receptions. We know this offense, I'm going to assume, is going to be good again next year under Ben Johnson. Let's hope he's still there. Even if he's not, I think there's still enough here for Amon-Ra St. Brown. You still got Goff here. He's in a great spot going into the following year. Very safe player. Love Amon-Ra going into 2025. The next up, let's talk about another wide receiver. And that's a wide receiver who missed part of this season early in the year, and that's Puka Nacua of the Rams. But it just really did not end up mattering, because even if you drafted Puka Nacua early in your drafts going into the year, although you didn't have him for weeks 2 through 5, and he was only able to do so much in week 1, you didn't have him weeks 2 through 7, outside of his Mike Tyson game where he got ejected early, right? He was absolutely fantastic every other game to finish out the year for Puka Nacua, except for week 16. We're looking at 17 or more fantasy points with a ceiling of 41.8 fantasy points. And if the fantasy playoffs were any indication of anything, it's that I don't know what's happening with Cooper Kupp on this team anymore, having one of the worst playoff runs of all times for a fantasy wide receiver. Nonetheless, we know that Puka Nacua is the clear-cut number one option on this team. So Puka going into next year, I think you could argue could even be a little bit higher. But overall, I like him right here at the 1.7. He's a clear-cut number one option for Matthew Stafford or whoever's at quarterback, I guess. Maybe you could argue there might be a change there. Something happens with Stafford. But nonetheless, Puka going in next year should be great. Only played 11 games this year, 106 targets, 79 catches, 990 receiving yards, 3 receiving touchdowns. But like I said, he only played in 11 games. So just imagine a full season out of Puka like we got in his rookie season. So I like him right here. I think that would be a solid selection. And then moving along here, I think we're going to go with another running back. And I do believe that this player could go earlier as well. And like I said, really for the next couple picks, that's going to be how I feel about just about everybody. But it's got to be Jahmyr Gibbs next off the board here, sitting at the RB4 at the time I'm recording this, and just a super solid year. Double digits in every game on the season, even with co-running back on this team, David Montgomery, having a ton of success. And he only had 2 single-digit games this year, including Week 15 where he got hurt, right? So, Gibbs just a ton of success in this system, in this offense. Even if, Ben Johnson's not the offensive coordinator next year, I don't see any of that changing for Gibbs next year. Just under 1,200 rushing yards. Actually, is above 1,200 rushing yards on the season, including Monday Night Football. 12 rushing touchdowns, 43 receptions off of 54 targets, 3 receiving touchdowns, and some of those numbers may change based on Monday Night Football. But the production was there. Great season for Gibbs. No reason why he won't go in the first round, and certainly no reason why he shouldn't be selected this early in drafts. Now, the next player I want to take off of the board, I don't think it's going to be too early, and I think he's going to be kind of aggressively drafted next season, and that is rookie Brian Thomas Jr., who had a ton of success regardless of who was at quarterback, whether it was Trevor Lawrence, whether it was Mac Jones, it just did not matter. Single digits 4 times on the season. There were some up and downs here, but really not that many up and downs. There was a lot of ups, finishing as the wide receiver 3 on the season and just absolutely smoked in the fantasy playoffs in games that were absolutely meaningless. With Mac Jones at quarterback, 23.9 or more fantasy points in each of those games, 4 receiving touchdowns, was a true league winner, just under 1,200 receiving yards, 10 receiving touchdowns, 80 catches off of 122 receiving yards. And the best thing about Brian Thomas Jr. is that you are not concerned about the quarterback play. What's going to happen at quarterback? What's this offense going to look like? There's no concerns. If you draft Brian Thomas Jr., if this rookie season is any indication of anything, it's that he's quarterback proof. So I like Brian Thomas Jr. here. I have no problem whatsoever taking him this early going into the following season. Now, speaking of rookie players having success, I think that we do need to go ahead and take a rookie off of the board. So I do want to have a little bit of a discussion about this. I'm only going to mention one rookie in this video because we're a little early and landing spot's going to have huge implications here when it comes to these rookie players. But I do think there's at least 4 rookies. Could be more, don't get me wrong, but I think there's at least 4 rookies who will impact the first 4 rounds of fantasy drafts going into next season. But you guys already know what rookie I'm going to talk about. And of course, that's Ashton Jeanty. And yes, I'm going to use Rico Dowdle in place because Sleeper does not have rookies available yet. But Ashton Jeanty's got to be the first rookie taken off of boards in redraft formats. And most mock drafts for the upcoming NFL draft have Jeanty going to the Cowboys, which makes a lot of sense. But this is going to be one of the most hyped up, most sought after running backs when it comes to fantasy football. in a long time. I know Bijan was only, 2 seasons ago and everything, but Genty is going to be a player that fantasy managers aggressively draft. You could name 3 or 4 of your favorite running backs over the last 15 or 20 years, and he has a little bit of all of those guys in his game. And if he goes to the Cowboys, it's a clear-cut path. Zeke is dusty, crusty Zeke. Probably, maybe won't even be on the team next year. Rico Dowdle is set to be a free agent. I know the Cowboys don't have the best offensive line. You might have some questions about that team in general. You might have some questions about Dak Prescott coming off of a major injury. But nonetheless, the path for Genty to have a massive rookie season is obviously there. And like I said, most NFL drafts have his landing spot as the Cowboys, which makes perfect sense. But you never know. Regardless of wherever he goes or wherever he lands in the draft, he's still going to be a top 15 pick in the NFL draft and is going to have a clear pathway to a lot of fantasy production. So we're going to put Genty at the 1.10 and we will move along. I will go ahead and note that if I was going to talk about any other rookies in this video, in the first 4 rounds, once again, it's early. We don't have landing spots. I think I would argue Caleb Johnson at the running back position, Tet McMillan, and Luther Burden, but it's all both at the wide receiver position, but it's all going to depend on landing spot. Have some other names like maybe a Travis Hunter that could sneak in there as well. But ultimately, for the sake of today's video, we're just going to leave Genty at the 1.10 and keep it a bit simple. All right, let's keep on moving here and let's go to the 1.11. And I'm going to argue that we'll go ahead and take A.J. Brown off of the board here. Still a very solid season for A.J. Brown. Going to finish as the wide receiver 11 on the year. Was solid through the fantasy playoffs. Had a touchdown in each of the last 3 games. 12 or more fantasy points in those games. Over 1,000 receiving yards, 7 receiving touchdowns, 67 catches off of 97 targets, and he missed 3 games on the season, still ranked as the wide receiver 11, single digits just twice on the season. You know that he's tied to Jalen Hurts. You know that he's going to be in the same system next year. Always gets a little bit disrespected in the offseason and in draft season, but I think that A.J. Brown, very solid going into next season. And then to wrap up the first round, well, I do think there's a few players that could go here. I'm going to go ahead and take a running back off of the board, and that's going to be Kyren Williams of the Rams. Another player who in the offseason just kind of feels like he's potentially going to be a bit disrespected like this past season. And he was the RB7 last year, right? And he was the RB7 with missing quite a few games last year. And then this year, he was the RB6, just 1 game on the season with single digits, was solid through the fantasy playoffs. Just a solid season overall for Kyren. 14 rushing touchdowns, 2 receiving touchdowns, just under 1,300 rushing yards. I think that Kyren easily is a solid selection at the end of the first round, but you're going to see quite a few players here as well that I think you guys could kind of move around, and I think it all makes sense, right? So with that being said, let's go ahead and move to the 2.1 here into the second round, and I do want to take another second-year wide receiver off of the board here, and that's going to be Malik Nabers of the Giants. And, we talked about Brian Thomas Jr. having a lot of success regardless of who was playing at the quarterback position, and truly, we really saw that out of Malik Nabers this season as well. It was arguably worse for Nabers, right? I think most of us would say it was worse at quarterback for Nabers. Daniel Jones, Tommy DeVito, and Drew Lock. And if they weren't facing the Colts, it wasn't great, but Nabers always showed up, always had a consistent floor. Going to finish the season as the wide receiver 8, solid through the fantasy playoffs. A league winner. 13.8 in week 16 was fine, a good floor, but 24.2 fantasy points in week 15, 36.1 against the Colts in week 17, 2 touchdowns in that game. Solid rookie season. We are assuming that the Giants are going to draft a rookie quarterback in the offseason, but it can't get much worse than what Nabers went through at quarterback this past year. So just under 1,200 receiving yards for Nabers, 6 receiving touchdowns, 104 receiving yards, top 10 wide receiver in fantasy. Like him here to kick off the second round. And then let's move into our next selection here at the 2.2. And once again, I think that this could go in a lot of different directions, but I am going to take quite a few running backs over the next couple selections. And this might feel a little bit boring, but I think that Josh Jacobs should be off the board next. Another player who just had a very solid season, and I feel like is going to be pushed back a little bit in drafts because he just doesn't feel as exciting. And that's almost what happened to him going into this past season, right? But your RB5 on the season, single digits in just one game on the whole year. And that was, the Malik Willis revenge game where Malik Willis rushed for over 70 rushing yards. And it was just one of those weird games, right? But outside of that, he became the complete, focal point of this offense and was just so good between week 7 and week 17 with 20 or more fantasy points in every game except for 2. And I know he wasn't great in the fantasy championship, but it was a tough matchup against the Vikings, and he at least got you 10.9 fantasy points, under 1,300 or just under 1,300 rushing yards, 14 rushing touchdowns, 340 receiving yards, and a receiving touchdown for Jacobs on the season. And, he's going to be with the Packers next year. We know that. He's going to be the focal point of this offense again. Those receivers on this team are way too up and down, way too inconsistent. Jacobs is going to continue to be the heartbeat of this team. So I like Jacobs off the board next at the 2.2. And like I said here, we're going to take a couple running backs in this round in a row. Quite a few that I do want to talk about and that I think are a bit interchangeable in terms of ADP here. But, let's just go ahead and take the man, the myth, the legend, Derrick Henry off of the board here. And, Henry is going to be really interesting in the offseason because obviously he's finishing the year as the RB2. But I guarantee you that he'll be a bit pushed back in drafts because of his age and the wear and tear and Lamar Jackson's on this team. I mean, all the reasons that people did not listen to me in the offseason, as they also did not listen to me with Saquon Barkley, but all the reasons that people did not listen to me when it came to Derrick Henry and why I liked him going into this year, I think are going to be relevant again going into this coming season. And yeah, there's always a little bit of risk here, but I think that Henry's going to be, once again, a very good value at his given ADP. And yes, eventually the wear and tear is going to have to, catch up to him. Wheels could fall off here at any moment. But as I argued in this past offseason, this is the perfect offense for Henry to be in. He doesn't have to do every single thing here. Lamar Jackson does so much himself that I don't think that the wear and tear for me quite yet is of major concern or of any more concern than it is for a player like Saquon Barkley, for example, or Josh Jacobs, right? So Henry, a fantastic season, single digits just once, unfortunately, in the first round of the playoffs against a bad Giants team, but nonetheless, double digits in every other game. Great in week 16 and 17. He only had under or less than 14 fantasy points on the season 3 times. Just a great season. Just under 1,800 rushing yards, 14 rushing touchdowns, 170 receiving yards, and 2 receiving touchdowns for Henry. So I think he still absolutely belongs here in the second round. And then let's take another player off the board here at the running back position. And I do think that this is going to be another kind of polarizing selection that it's really going to come down to your own personal opinion, and that's how it was this past offseason. I'm going to take Devon Achane off the board here, and I think the thing with Achane is that the upside's always there, and it's so hard to ignore. He was a little bit injured early in the season, didn't really end up missing a ton of time from it or anything, but it was relevant at the same time or shortly after the same time that Tua, missed those couple of weeks. But outside of that, Achane was money. I know he was bad in week 17 and they pulled him early and, you felt like maybe you lost your fantasy championship due to Achane, but some of that was out of his control. A, we don't really know if he was hurt in week 17 or not. And B, he just wasn't necessary for the game and the Dolphins have a chance at the playoffs. So he got essentially pulled from the game, right? But nonetheless, the double digits in every game on the season except for 4. Had a really nice stretch between weeks 8 and 16 where he had 14.6 or more fantasy points in every game but 1, 20 or more fantasy points in all those games except for 2. Missed some time this year, only played through 16 total games, not including week 18, but he still had 786 rushing yards, 5 rushing touchdowns, and where A-Chain makes up for, not as many rushing yards, not as many rushing touchdowns is 87 targets, 78 receptions, 592 receiving yards, and 6 receiving touchdowns. And I think he's still going to see a ton of volume in this upcoming season and be a huge part of this offense, especially now that we've seen this offense not exactly look like we were expecting going into the season. So I think that A-Chain makes a lot of sense here. And once again, it's going to come down to your personal opinion on A-Chain and if you think he's worth the risk, all that stuff. But ultimately, I do think that A-Chain, or at least enough fantasy managers will take A-Chain at this point that he's fine to be off the board here. So we'll take a little bit of a break from running backs here, and we're going to go with a tight end. And we're going to take our first tight end off of the board. And that's going to be Brock Bowers, of course. And, I don't know how early Bowers is going to go in mock drafts at this point in the offseason, but I think he's going to go pretty dang early. And I think moving into the summer, we might see Bowers go a little ridiculously early. And I think he's going to start to be kind of that Travis Kelce of drafts where, sometimes he gets drafted at the turn and the end of the first round. And I think an interesting comparison is kind of what we saw happen with Sam Laporta, where Laporta was the first tight end taken in drafts going into this past fantasy season. And Laporta was still solid, a top 10 fantasy tight end, but didn't quite live up to what he did in his rookie season. And I'm afraid that'll happen with Bowers. Personally, I think he'll still be very good next year, but it's going to be very difficult to replicate what he did in his rookie season. At the same time, I do believe he's in a higher tier than Sam Laporta. So I won't be surprised if he's able to replicate the success he had in his rookie season. But, I mean, just an incredible rookie season, breaking what Puka did in terms of rookie records and Puka's rookie season. I mean, it's absolutely bonkers, right? So most receptions by a rookie ever. He's a tight end. So 144 targets, 108 receptions, just under 1,200 receiving yards for Brock Bowers. A couple single-digit games in his rookie season, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. But he's a tight end. You get a little bit more of an excuse and just a super high ceiling. Had that, really nice. Really, weeks 1 through 13, you had single digits 3 times and double digits in every other game, right? Bowers was great. We all know it. And I do think easily he'll be the first tight end off of the board going into next season. All right. Let's move along to another running back. Like I said, a lot of running backs that I want to talk about. And let's take Bucky Irving off of the board here. And I do believe in the offseason, there's going to be an aggressive amount of hype around Bucky Irving, which I'm completely okay with. And I do think he'll kind of move up into this range overall, into the second round, kind of mid-second round area, especially, if the Buccaneers do make the playoffs, if they do win in week 18, and I don't even really care if they win in the wild card in the playoffs or not, but if they have a good offensive showing in the next 2 weeks, there's going to be a lot of hype around this team, a lot of hype around, what Baker Mayfield's going to be able to do in another season with this team, what this offense is gonna look like. Bucky Irving, Rachaad White, Mike Evans, assuming he's back, Jalen McMillan as the wide receiver 2, as Chris Godwin is set to be a free agent. You never know; he could be back with the Bucs. He might not be. Kate Otten at tight end. Good enough offensive line, great offensive line when it comes to the run game. So I think that Bucky Irving is going to go relatively high in drafts, and I think right in this area makes a lot of sense. Just over 1,000 rushing yards, 7 rushing touchdowns, 45 catches on the season, a top 20 fantasy running back, but he wasn't really even getting like RB1 volume on a consistent basis to like week 10 of the season. He had one or two games, really two games with double digit touches before that. Every other game, less than that, although he had some receiving work. So, Rashad White still playing a part, a little sprinkle of Sean Tucker somewhere in there. But I do believe going in next year that Bucky Irving will get a lot more of that volume. So overall, Bucky, I think, belongs easily in the mid second round. And speaking of rookie running backs, the next running back that I want to talk about, who I think is going to get a ton of hype in the offseason, is Chase Brown, right? It's going to be a really interesting Bengals team by the time we're drafting actual fantasy teams next season. But I think that Chase Brown is going to be right up there, right? Not as good of an offensive line here, but you're still going to have Burrow. I'll go ahead and say you're still going to have Jamar Chase. Higgins probably gone, but there's a chance he's back. And Chase Brown's going to be in the middle of all of that. I mean, just completely took this backfield over from Zach Moss, kind of similar to what Bucky Irving was able to do. But Chase Brown did it a little bit earlier on the season, right? And although there was some injury to Zach Moss as well, nonetheless, I mean, single digits 4 times on the season. And once he basically took over this backfield, right, I mean, it was just a wrap, right? And second half of the season was just fantastic for Chase Brown. 990 rushing yards, 7 rushing touchdowns, 54 catches, 4 receiving touchdowns, top 12 running back in fantasy. And I know he kind of ended in the fantasy championship on a sour note and maybe a worried note. I mean, he stole 13 fantasy points in that game, but, the ankle injury and all that stuff. But this is redraft, not dynasty, so we're not too worried, right? And overall, I think Chase Brown just belongs here in the middle of the second round and is going to be a player that's going to get a lot of hype going into next season. Okay, let's kind of start to breeze through some of these selections as we start to wrap up the second round here. But I think we're going to see a string of wide receivers gone next. And I'll go ahead and make the argument here for Terry McLaurin, who's coming off of just a monster season as Jaden Daniels' number 1 receiver, finishing the year as the wide receiver 5. Could have finished higher, but he gave us a goose egg in the championship, essentially. Just 1 catch for 1.5 fantasy points and a great matchup and a great game script, but AJ Terrell really showed up. Nonetheless, on the season, 4 single-digit games, monster year, double digits in every other game, over 1,000 receiving yards, 12 receiving touchdowns, 105 targets, 74 receptions. Great season for Terry McLaurin. He is Jaden Daniels' number 1 target. We'll go ahead and take him off of the board. And then let's take another wide receiver, veteran wide receiver, off of the board here. And that's going to be Tyreek Hill. And I do think these next couple of receivers we talk about are a bit interchangeable, of course. But, I know Hill had a down season, but you could kind of see it towards the end of the year. There is still plenty of upside with Tyreek Hill. And this whole entire offense just seems to be in a bit of a strange place. But at least the fact that he had 19.5 fantasy points with the backup quarterback in the fantasy championship leaves you feeling a little bit better. But obviously on the season, a bit disappointing with 6 single-digit fantasy finishes. The rest double digits, but you're missing that consistent ceiling, or at least you were this past year with Tyreek Hill. 939 receiving yards, 6 receiving touchdowns, 79 catches, 120 targets. Still a solid year for Hill. The Dolphins offense, kind of up in the air, it feels like, but I feel like Hill still deserves to be a second-round player. Now, the question is, we look at McLaurin and Hill. The next receiver I'm going to take off the board, I do think could easily go before these 2 receivers, and probably should have, realistically. You know what? We're changing this. Let's go ahead and swap Terry McLaurin with our next receiver off of the board, and that is going to be, sorry, I hit the wrong button here. That is going to be Nico Collins of the Houston Texans, and then we'll go ahead and we'll throw Terry in right after Nico, and then we'll put Tyreek Hill after Scary Terry. But I do believe that Nico deserves some love going into the following season. Just don't forget, he was the wide receiver 1 through the first 5 weeks of the season before he was hurt and missed all that time. And, he had the down game in week 11, his first game back, but he had that big touchdown early in that game against Dallas called back. And he laid a dud in week 17 in the fantasy championship, but the entire Texans offense did. Still a solid year for Nico, 968 receiving yards, 6 receiving touchdowns, 94 targets, 63 catches through just 11 games on the season. Some obvious regression from CJ Stroud at the quarterback position this year, but I'm not too worried about it. I still think that Nico should be one of the first receivers taken in the second round, and overall is still going to give you a safe floor going into next year. Plus, you look at this team next year, Nico's a clear-cut wide receiver 1. I hope and pray for a great recovery for Tank Dell, but I think a lot of us are fearing that Tank Dell may not play football next year at all, and Stephon Diggs is set to be a free agent. So we'll see what happens, but nonetheless, I think Nico is definitely set up for success going into the following season. All right, let's take another running back off of the board here who you might be surprised is not off of the board yet, and with what he did in the fantasy playoffs, maybe deserves to be. That's going to be Jonathan Taylor of the Colts. And I mean, I like Taylor just as much, right now in the offseason as I like A-Chain or Bucky or Chase Brown. A lot of these players interchangeable, but yes, Jonathan Taylor had a monster run in the fantasy playoffs, okay? 39.8 fantasy points in week 16, 27.6 in week 17, 5 touchdowns in that stretch. We look on the season for JT, single digits in just 3 games, played in 13 games on the season, just under 1,300 rushing yards, 10 rushing touchdowns, a receiving touchdown, and 133 receiving yards off his 17 catches. But he did almost half that damage in the last 2 games of the season against 2 really bad run defenses who were playing for nothing, which I'm not taking away from Jonathan Taylor, but it is just something to think about. And I don't know what this Colts team is. I just don't know what they are going into next year. I want to like JT more, but I really am just kind of worried about the state of the Colts. Anthony Richardson, are we even going to see him to wrap up this season? Don't think Joe Flacco is going to be the backup next year. I think they're going to continue with Anthony Richardson, which I'm not saying is a bad thing, but it's still a bit of a question mark. What is the receiving game on this team? It's been very up and down between Pittman and Josh Downs. What is the state of this franchise as a whole? It's just hard to say, and I think some of these things just leave a bit of a question mark out there for Jonathan Taylor. So I still really like JT, but he kind of falls back a bit here in the second round. Then let's take 2 receivers here to wrap up the second round and bring us into the third round. And I think there are plenty of names here we could discuss, but let's take Drake London off of the board here of the Atlanta Falcons. And I do think that there's a lot to talk about when it comes to Drake London because it's a bit of a question mark here. We don't know what to expect out of the quarterback play, out of Michael Penix next year. I'm not saying that it's going to be bad. I'm not saying that's going to be great. I would assume Kirk Cousins is gone, as we have already received indication from the Falcons that that's going to happen. And Drake London, had a great season, right? Single digits just 3 times on the year. Looked really good with Penix at quarterback in week 17. Looked good in week 16 before Drake London had to exit the game early. So I still like London a lot. Over 1,000 receiving yards, 7 receiving touchdowns, 90 catches off 140 receiving yards, but maybe the upside feels a little bit limited going into the following season. Speaking of limited upside at wide receiver, let's take another wide receiver off the board, and that's going to be Garrett Wilson. And listen, we don't know, is Garrett Wilson going to get traded? Is he going to be with the Jets? Is Aaron Rodgers going to be the Jets quarterback? Are they going to sign a free agent? Are they going to draft a quarterback? We don't really know anything about Garrett Wilson going into next year. But I'm always a fan of Garrett Wilson. Still a top 15 wide receiver on the season. Single digits just 4 times. Saw a lot of volume go away to Devontae Adams, and he still had a very solid year. Over 1,000 receiving yards, 7 receiving touchdowns, 149 targets, 97 catches. Lots of question marks here. But I was going to make the argument for Garrett Wilson. I still think he can be plenty productive, especially in PPR formats next year. All right. Going to try and go a little bit quicker here, but nonetheless, I'm going to make an argument for T. Higgins to be the next player off of the board. Could be a wide receiver one on another team. Could be the wide receiver one for the Patriots, or where a lot of people are kind of thinking he may go, right? And I said it all season long. If Higgins did not get hurt this year and miss as many games as he did, which is one of the knocks on Higgins, he could have easily finished as a top 5 wide receiver on the fantasy season. And really, I mean, Chase still had a much better season than Higgins, but Higgins did not play that much poorly compared to Jamar Chase. Higgins had a great overall season. Single digits twice in games he played in. Double digits in every other game, 858 receiving yards, 10 receiving touchdowns, was money through the fantasy playoffs, was a league winner in the fantasy championship, 69 catches, nice, off 104 targets, top 20 wide receiver, and he could be a number 1 receiver for a different team next year, like the Patriots, and a young quarterback in Drake May. So I'm all for T. Higgins going into the 2025 season. Now, a running back who we haven't taken off the board, who hasn't gotten any love yet, who had a really great season, is James Cook. And Cook is another name here that could go much earlier. Maybe could go before some of the running backs we talked about. The RB7 on the season, single digits just 3 times on the year, missed 1 game on the year as well, but double digits in every other game. Super solid, safe floor a majority of weeks, 981 rushing yards, 15 rushing touchdowns, even with Josh Allen having a ton of rushing touchdowns himself, 32 receptions, 2 receiving touchdowns. Very solid year for James Cook. Still like him tremendously going into the following season. Then we get into a couple interesting players here, and we'll just go ahead and take the veteran himself off of the board, because I do think he's still going to go early next year, and that's Mike Evans. You look at what Evans did this past year, is more than likely going to hit 1,000 receiving yards on the year through week 18. Good matchup, going to be a competitive game script from the Bucs, as they have to win that game to get in the playoffs. Just under it at the time of recording this. Through the fantasy season, 915 receiving yards, 11 receiving touchdowns, and obviously missed 3 games with that hamstring injury. So still a very solid season from Mike Evans. We talked about this offense earlier in the video. Top 10 finish for Mike Evans in terms of fantasy wide receivers. Still love him going in to the following season. Think he fits right in the beginning of the 3rd round. Now let's take a young wide receiver off of the board here, and that's going to be Ladd McConkey, who had a very solid season once he started to get rolling in the system. Top 15 wide receiver on the season, 104 targets, 77 receptions, just over 1,000 receiving yards, 7 receiving touchdowns. I am still all in on Ladd McConkey going into the following season. Like I said, took a little bit of time to get rolling here, but between weeks 8 and 17, double digits in every game he played in except for 1, and you saw those flashes early in the season, even when it was a bit inconsistent. He's a clear-cut number 1 option for Justin Herbert going into the following season. I don't think Quentin Johnston's going to, threaten that. I don't think Josh Palmer is. And, the Chargers could end up being one of these teams that signs a player like T. Higgins or Chris Godwin or Stephon Diggs, or drafts another wide receiver. But Ladd McConkey is going to have enough of a role in this offense that he's going to be a player that I think a lot of fantasy managers are going to be very high on going into the following season. All right, next up, I'm going to be boring and take another tight end off of the board. That's going to be Trey McBride, who I do think will be the next tight end to go off of boards going into next season. Your tight end 3 on the season had a monster game in week 17. May have only scored 1 receiving touchdown on the year, but he did it when it mattered the most. Over 1,000 receiving yards. Yes, like I said, 1 receiving touchdown on the year, 1 rushing touchdown as well. 136 targets, 104 receptions, top 5 tight end. I think that Bowers and McBride will be the first 2 tight ends off of the board going into next season easily. Then you're going to get some combination of like some of the more veteran-esque guys, Mark Andrews, George Kittle, Travis Kelce, and you'll probably have Laporta in there as well. And then The rest are a little bit up in the air. Maybe Jonnu Smith. We'll find out. But I think McBride will be the second tight end taken off boards after Brock Bowers. Great season for McBride. Even with the lack of touchdowns, he had a tremendous year in terms of receptions and all that stuff. So I think he goes off the board next here. And then we're going to be boring again and take our first quarterback off the board. And we'll just go with Lamar Jackson, who's finishing as your quarterback one on the season. A fantastic year for Lamar Jackson. 19 or more fantasy points in every game except for 2, and 22 or more fantasy points in every game except for 4 games. Crazy. Anyways, quarterback one in the season. You guys know the story here. Fighting for an MVP in another season for Lamar Jackson. He's just under 4,000 passing yards, 39 passing touchdowns, 4 picks, 852 rushing yards, 4 rushing touchdowns. I think easily, while there's a lot of candidates here, Lamar will be the first quarterback taken off of boards at this point in the offseason going into next year. All right, it's going to start to get very interesting as we go through the next round and a half. But the next player that I'm going to take off of the board here is going to be Jackson Smith-Njigba of the Seattle Seahawks, who is finishing up the year as a top 10 player at the wide receiver position. Another guy who felt like it took a little bit of time to get rolling, but I mean, he gave you single digits in just 3 games on the year, just under 1,200 receiving yards, 6 receiving touchdowns, 132 targets, 96 catches, 7 scratch that last part. And actually, it was single digits in 4 games on the season, as he did not end up having a great game in the fantasy championship. But nonetheless, double digits every other week. And yeah, you kind of have the elephant in the room of DK Metcalf still on this team. But don't forget, JSN was the number 1 wide receiver in most fantasy managers' minds coming out of the 2023 draft. Got way more implemented into this offense this past year, and I think going into next year, he's going to have the most fantasy value out of any Seahawks wide receiver and be the most highly drafted. So we'll go ahead and take him off the board next. And then once again, just to kind of fill this in, let's take another quarterback off the board, and that'll be Josh Allen of the Buffalo Bills. Neck and neck there with Lamar at the quarterback position for MVP this season, but obviously just a monster season for Josh Allen. I know week 16 was disappointing, but between week 16, week 5, week 4, and week 2, you had 14 or less fantasy points, right? Every other game on the season, you had 20 or more fantasy points with a ceiling of 51 fantasy points. So, well, for some of you guys, he may have lost you your league. For majority of you guys, he was still a league winner, even with the dud in week 16. 3,700 passing yards, 28 passing touchdowns, 6 picks, 531 rushing yards, 12 rushing touchdowns. Your quarterback 2 on the season. We'll take him as the second quarterback off the board. Okay. Now, when we start to look at things here, it begins to get a bit murky. For sure. So I'm going to speed run through a lot of these, but I'm going to take Christian McCaffrey off the board. He's got to go somewhere, right? I mean, C-Mac's got to be taken somewhere. And I just refuse to believe that if Christian McCaffrey is fully healthy going into next season, that by the end of the 3rd round, fantasy managers are going to pass on him. If you want to pass on him, that's fine. But I think that somebody is going to be willing to take the risk on Christian McCaffrey. So I want to take him off the board, and I want to take Breece Hall off the board. I know it was disappointing this year for Breece Hall as well, and the Jets are in a complete state of question mark. But I think that there's still plenty of upside with Breece Hall, and he was a bit banged up to finish out the season and still had a lot of solid games. And really, when you look at it, single digits just 5 times on the season, 819 rushing yards, 5 rushing touchdowns, 54 catches, off 71 targets, 468 receiving yards, 2 receiving touchdowns. If the offense was in a better state, I think Breece Hall would have had a much better season. Still a top 20 running back on the season. In a sense, kind of similar to Christian McCaffrey, where there's just a lot of upside here, and I think a lot of fantasy managers will still take the risk at this point in the draft. And then we just talked about JSN, which is interesting because I want to take Marvin Harrison Jr. off the board next. And I think that MH, who had a very disappointing, rookie season, could be viewed in a similar sense to JSN, where I think his second year in the league gets a little bit more polished out, gets a little bit more implemented into this offense, and overall, I think is going to have a much better second overall year in the league. But I do think there's a bit of a question mark around the Cardinals as well, and the state of this franchise right now. I think that the coaching staff is safe. I think that Kyler Murray is safe, but you never really know. It just feels like a big question mark. And so I think that could be an issue here. But overall, I think that Marvin Harrison Jr. will go somewhere between the end of the third round and beginning of the fourth round, excuse me. So I want to take him off the board and just leave that with you guys. Just remember, JSN was this sought out number one clear-cut wide receiver in his rookie draft, had a much better second overall year in the league. And I think that a similar thing could easily happen to Marvin Harrison Jr. But nonetheless, let's move along and fly through the fourth round. And I'll say for the fourth round, you guys could view these players however you want, but I just want to mention a lot of these players as potential players who could be selected between the third and the fourth round, to be honest. But let's take DJ Moore. I think he's still going to be the clear-cut number one option for Caleb Williams in his second year quarterback. I think DJ Moore is going to have a very safe floor. That's what he was this year. Single digits in 4 games, every other game, 10 or more fantasy points. Not always a great ceiling, but still is going to be solid. Be a number one wide receiver, give you a good floor. And that's that for DJ Moore. Next up, I do want to mention a veteran running back who still had a very solid year, and that's Joe Mixon of the Houston Texans. Top 12 running back on the season, missed 3 games, single digits in 4 games of the season, including the fantasy championship, and was not very good through the fantasy playoffs with a tough overall schedule, but still was very good on the year. 13 total games played, 993 rushing yards, 11 rushing touchdowns, 35 catches, and 1 receiving touchdown. I do believe, kind of like when we talked about Nico Collins earlier, there's a little bit of there's less excitement about the Texans going into next year unless they do something absolutely crazy in the playoffs and their offense looks absolutely fantastic. So I think Mixon will drop a bit in drafts going into next year, but I suppose only time can tell. And then I will take a player next that I'm always high on if you guys have watched this channel over the past couple years and that I really like going into next year, who I always encourage you guys to start, but will get pushed back in drafts as he always does. That's Devonta Smith of the Philadelphia Eagles, who had a very solid year, top 25 wide receiver in fantasy football, missed 3 games on the year, single digits in 3 games on the season. Outside of that, double digits every other week. 833 receiving yards, 8 receiving touchdowns. You always have a safe floor with Devonta Smith, and he was money through the fantasy playoffs. 28 fantasy points in week 15. Not great in week 16, but didn't kill you. 11.1 fantasy points, then 30 fantasy points in week 17 in the fantasy championship. Clear-cut number 2 wide receiver on this team going into next year, still sees a ton of volume, is under contract with the Eagles. Nothing to worry about here. Devonta Smith always gets disrespected and shouldn't. All right, the next couple players that I want to go over, they're not really in any exact order, but there are a lot of players that I really like here. And another kind of young wide receiver, he's a wide receiver 2 on his team that I really like going into next year, is Jordan Addison, a player that I really encourage you guys to ignore the noise about in the offseason and to draft at his ADP. And he's finishing the fantasy season as the wide receiver 12. Now, in similar fashion, like we talked about with Justin Jefferson, maybe there's a bit of a question mark here at quarterback, but I'm not going to worry about it right now. And while it was a bit up and down with Jordan Addison, you're still kind of drafting him as like a flex type wide receiver who has a ton of upside. And even though he had that inconsistency and you can't really say he had a safe floor, the upside made up for it. And we look on the season, we had single digits in 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 games, which is a little bit more than I like, but it's still not awful. Double digits in the rest, very consistent through the fantasy playoffs, and had those 2 big games kind of leading up to the fantasy playoffs. Through 14 games, 875 receiving yards, 9 receiving touchdowns, 93 targets, 62 targets for Addison. So I still like him in this range quite a bit, and you got to love that Kevin O'Connell offense and the system that he's in. All right, next up, I'm just going to talk about 2 veteran wide receivers very quickly. And I'm going to talk about Cooper Kupp, and then I also want to talk about DK Metcalf. And they're just kind of in a similar tier for me. You got Puka taking over the volume in the Rams offense. You got JSN taking over the volume in the Seattle Seahawks offense. So, you know, Kupp had like the worst playoff run ever in fantasy. 0 points, 5.4 points, 3.9 points. But, outside of that, he was pretty dang solid with only 2 other single-digit games on the season. And really, weeks 8 through 14 were like incredible for Puka and Kupp. They combined for 2 single-digit games. So, it was still a solid year. Only played 12 games, 710 receiving yards, 6 receiving touchdowns, 100 targets, 67 catches. But there's going to be a really sour taste in fantasy managers' minds when it comes to Kupp because of the playoffs. So I'll just leave it at that. DK Metcalf, like I said, it wasn't that bad. 939 receiving yards, 4 tutties, 103 targets, 63 receptions. Played in 14 games. Was playing banged up all season long. It's just tough here, right? Single digits in 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 games, 7 games, including week 17. I'm sorry. So, he'll go somewhere, somewhere in this range. And I was going to leave it at that because I don't personally, I'm not going to be targeting Metcalf going in next year. But one other receiver here who I do think could go higher and definitely go before those 2 players is Zay Flowers of the Ravens. Still a solid season for Zay Flowers. Top 22 finish at the position. Single digits in 5 games on the season, including week 17 in a great matchup where the Ravens were lighting up the Texans. But nonetheless, he's a good floor play, has some upside that we saw early in the season. It just kind of disappeared and is still, next to Mark Andrews, the number 1 receiving option on this team. Over 1,000 receiving yards, 4 receiving touchdowns, 114 targets, 73 catches for Zay Flowers. So I still like Flowers going into next year, but I think in the 4th round is kind of appropriate and could easily go in front of some of the other receivers that we just mentioned. Now, I do want to mention a running back who had a very good season until he got hurt at the worst time possible, and that's Alvin Kamara. And I have Kamara a bit further back. Like I said, still a very solid season. 950 rushing yards, 6 rushing touchdowns, 89 targets, 68 catches, 543 receiving yards, 2 receiving touchdowns. Top 15 running back in fantasy football. Single digits just once on the season. But I have him a little bit further back because I don't know what in the world the Saints are going to be next year. Is Carr going to be the quarterback? Is Spencer Rattler? Is Jake Hayner? It's not going to be Jake Hayner, but, there's just such a question mark here. What is Chris Olave's future? He's just completely disappeared, which I respect due to the concussion, but, who are the wide receivers on this team? Who are the tight ends? Is Taysom Hill alive? There's just so many question marks. Who's going to be the head coach? The state of this organization right now is really messy. So I have Kamara a bit further back, but I do think that he'll potentially really end up being a great ADP going into next year. Then another kind of a veteran running back that I think we at least need to talk about in this range is going to be Kenneth Walker. He's just is always in this range, and we got the same Kenneth Walker that we always get. Looks really good. Then he's hurt. He comes back. He looks really good. And the Seahawks use him a ton in all areas. Then the Seahawks offensive line lets him down. Then he's hurt again. And then he's up and down. And then he's hurt. Then he's out. So listen, there's a lot of upside with Walker. And he did look great early in the season when he was healthy. But man, Zach Charbonnet also looked great this year. For the most part, when he was the RB1. So it's a bit messy here. And it wasn't awful for Walker, but it's just a hard season to judge. And I think he's going to be around this area going into next year. So I'll just leave it at that. But it's just really hard to judge that one. Then I do want to talk about another running back in this kind of veteran range, right? And that's going to be David Montgomery, because I do think if Monty finished the season healthy and was able to play in week 16 and 17 and had a better week 15 game, we'd be talking about Monty a bit higher because he still has such a role in this offense, even behind Jahmyr Gibbs. And Gibbs is just going to continue to rise up in volume. But Monty had a fantastic season, 775 rushing yards, 12 rushing touchdowns, 36 catches for 341 receiving yards, top 20 finish at the position, and probably would have finished in the top 10 if he did not get hurt. And just don't forget, I mean, he was having all these double-digit games, right? Single digits in just 2 games on the year, including the one he got hurt. Double digits in every other game, with Jahmyr Gibbs doing what Gibbs did all season long. So Monty, I still think maybe kind of in like, the beginning of the dead zone area for running backs, so to speak, close to where like a Walker, Kamara's go. And maybe it's not quite the start of the dead zone, but you get what I'm saying, a little bit later. But I think that Monty is definitely a player to keep an eye on, especially, if he is able to play through the actual playoffs and show us a little bit of steam to wrap up the season. All right, 2 more players that I want to make sure get mentioned, and then I'll name everybody else who could potentially be here, and then we'll wrap up today's video. But I want to make an argument for Rashee Rice because he was just on absolute fire before he got hurt and all of that. I mean, 17 or more fantasy points in 3 straight games with a ceiling of 29 fantasy points. I still think he's in front of Xavier Worthy on this roster. Hopkins probably maybe won't be back next year. And then you got Hollywood Brown. I don't actually know off the top of my head if Hollywood Brown is signed through next year or not, or what the deal with Hopkins is. But Rashee Rice will be the number 1 wide receiver regardless here. And this is still an offense that can support multiple wide receivers. Xavier Worthy, still an impressive rookie season. It doesn't quite make the top 4 rounds, but Xavier Worthy, a name worth mentioning in the next 2 rounds as well. But I think that Rashee Rice has that kind of wide receiver 1 build and can easily, as long as he's deemed healthy going to next year, I think we'll easily go in the first 4 rounds. So we'll find out, and we'll find out how many other wide receivers are active on that team as well at that point in the offseason. Now, one last running back here in the first 4 rounds. That's going to be Chuba Hubbard of the Carolina Panthers, who had a very good season. I know he missed week 17 right after having a career game and maybe pushing you into week 17, but still a great year for Chuba Hubbard. Single digits in 4 games on the season, just under 1,200 rushing yards, 10 rushing touchdowns, 43 catches for 171 receiving yards, and a receiving touchdown. Great year for Chuba, top 15 running back. Missed a tough week to miss, but nonetheless, Chuba had a great season. Not too concerned about Jonathan Brooks. Unfortunately, he could miss all of next year, if not most of next year. There's nobody else on this team that worries me, but you never know what happens in the draft and in the offseason. So still like Chuba within the first 4 rounds, especially with the success that the Panthers have had as of late offensively. Now, in terms of who else is left, I think that there's a lot of names to mention. We still have the rest of the quarterbacks. Jalen Hurts, Jaden Daniels, Joe Burrow. All those guys will probably start to fall off the board if they haven't already. I don't want to get too much into tight ends. I think that you'll probably see some sort of like Andrews, Laporta, Kelsey, Kittle go. But who knows exactly when they're going to go, and who knows exactly when the quarterbacks are going to go. But Hurts, Daniels, and Burrow, I think, will be the next quarterbacks taken off of the board. In terms of wide receivers, I still think George Pickens, Jamison Williams, Cortland Sutton, Jalen McMillan. If Chris Godwin is not back with the Bucs, could be off the board here. Chris Godwin, depending on his landing spot, could be gone by now. Brandon Ayuk, with no Debo on that team, more than likely next year, I think could be gone. Debo, depending on his landing spot, could be gone. Chris Olave, I mean, he's going to be mentioned at some point. Devontae Adams, I mean, he still showed some life this past season. It's going to depend on where he is. Stephon Diggs, going to depend on where he is. Jalen Waddle, Michael Pittman, Khalil Shakir of the Bills, who I actually like quite a bit. Then Jaden Reed, I mean, we got to put a Packers wide receiver somewhere in here, and I will probably never draft Jaden Reed again, but he's probably in there. In terms of running backs, James Conner, who barely missed the cut for this video, probably up there. Brian Robinson, who definitely disappointed towards the end of the season, was a bit up and down, but the way that a Washington offense looks, I still like Brian Robinson. This is probably where I start the dead zone of running backs. Isaiah Pacheco, big question mark, but has to be mentioned. Rashad White, I still think will have some sort of role with the Bucs next year, even if Bucky takes over. Najee Harris, Probably got to mention him as well. Then J.K. Dobbins, if he's back with the Chargers, is really interesting, but they are one of these candidates to draft a running back as well, which makes a lot of sense. But Dobbins, a very solid season. So a lot of names to look at there that didn't quite make the cut here for the video. But I think those are, between those quarterbacks, a couple tight ends we mentioned, and then all those running backs and wide receivers who I'm not going to break down for you guys, I think would be kind of going in the next 2 rounds. So I don't think I missed anybody. I tried to prepare for this video. We talked about the rookies that could go, around after when we selected at the 1.10. And outside of that, I think I got just about everybody. There are still a couple of names. Xavier Worthy was the other guy that, we talked about, but didn't quite make the cut here. But since we talked about him, I feel like that was enough. Maybe a Jacoby Myers. Like I said, let me know in the comments down below if you guys think I missed anybody through the first 4 rounds. And then in terms of those honorable mentions, those would be another 24 picks. So through the first 6 rounds. So let me know if there's anybody else, not including rookies, that you guys think should have been mentioned. But for the most part, that's going to do it for today's video. There's a breakdown of the first 4 rounds of a 2025 mock draft going in to the 2025 fantasy football season, the day after the 2024 fantasy football season has ended. So hope you guys enjoyed the video. We're going to be here all off season long doing dynasty content, doing early 2025 redraft content, doing underdog best ball drafts, doing all kinds of content for you guys. So make sure you guys stick around, and I truly appreciate you guys making 2024 such a fantastic season here on The Catch, and let's make 2025 just as great of a season. So with that, I'll say thank you guys so much for watching and or listening. And remember, you saw it here on The Catch.